Hey guys, so today we are going to be doing something very different from what we normally do here on this channel. At least something very different from what I normally do. We are going to be doing a little bit of theory crafting today. So, this is a new piece of gear that was recently released in Japan. And this is arguably one of the most interesting pieces of gear I have ever seen in this game. So, it comes as a 5-star piece of gear, which means you need 777 shards to craft it, and then you can immediately raise it to level 30 without any extra shards. And when it's maxed out, it's going to give you plus 2 jump and plus 40 joules obtained, and it'll decrease your status resistance by 100. So this is interesting to say the least. The jump and the joules obtained are both really high values for that stat. At most, we have one jump on other pieces of gear, and it's a relatively rare stat to have. I can't even think of any non-VCR pieces of gear that actually have the jump stat off the top of my head. And joules obtained, I think the highest joules obtained on an item that I know of is the Arbor VCR, or Albea VCR at 20. If I remember correctly, it might not be that high, I'd have to double check. But needless to say, these are some pretty nutty values. Now, on the database, it's mentioning something like a shield and it has a percent, but it has no values for it, and I'm not exactly sure what that is, or if it's just like using the shield to cast the minus 100 status resistance onto your character. I'm not entirely sure. I have heard that Veil can protect you from statuses, but I have not tested it myself because I have been unable to get the item myself. But I wanted to go and theorycraft some ways that this might help you on certain maps, because one thing I can tell you right now, even if you can't use Veil, I still think this is a good piece of gear. And that's because these stats are really high that it gives you. As long as you're on a map where you deal with the status threats ahead of time, or you find some way to combat those status effects, whether even if you do get hit with a status, you can cleanse it. Um, it's definitely an interesting piece of gear and worth a piece of look. So let's go ahead and take a look at our units and see what kind of things we might be able to do with that. Because really this has a lot of uses, and the first use I can think of is going to come in the form of ranged units. The reason why I think this is going to do really well on a ranged unit is because, in general, ranged units have relatively low joules obtained. Um, they also have somewhat limited movement. I wouldn't say it's as bad as, say, like a mage, per se, but they do have kind of limited units. So this not only lets them get to higher ground easier, and we already know that range units can hit farther if they are up higher. That's a basic game mechanic in Takatame and the Alchemist code. So being able to get up higher is definitely a benefit for a ranged unit. The joules obtained. Ranged units also have relatively low joule gain. Not all of them, but most of them, especially like machinists, I think only have like in the 20s or something, without any kind of extra buffs. Think if you had like 20 joule gain for a second, if that got up to 60. 60 joules is enough for most attacks in the game. And even like the lowest joule gain of Berserkers at like, I think 15, that ups it to 55. And they're already getting joules when they're hit. So this piece of gear is going to let you more consistently throw out your skills a lot more often. It's kind of like the opposite of the hat in global, in that instead of giving you the initial joules, this is going to be more like a long haul item. This is going to benefit you in the long term. As the fight goes on, you are going to gain more and more joules, and you gain more tempo instead of getting it up front. Range units are definitely a good option for this piece of gear. Since they can stay out of the way, they're less likely to get hit by status and less by other ranged units on the field. So they can easily utilize this even without a Veil. I definitely think this is a cool piece of gear. One thing you should note though is that this gear does not add any damage. So because it doesn't add any damage, if you have to hit a certain number, it's just not going to help you there. But especially with ranged units and the Lyle bow, we're looking at 50 attack, 50 dex. That covers your attack stats. The jewel gain in this case is useless because the pouch is going to override that, obviously, with an additional 25 jewel gain on top of that. But 10 missile attack, that's already all your attack stats. And then you are going to need HP and speed. So in this particular situation, you would be sacrificing some speed. But if you can just hit units from wherever on the map, you don't have to move, and as long as you don't drop a count tier, you should be fine to just sit there and wait for your turn to come around again without moving. I wouldn't necessarily skip the HP because you don't want to get one shot, but you might even be able to do that depending on the map. Not particularly well advised though. The other major situation where I see this piece of gear as being really helpful is for someone like Arthur. So Arthur is a mixed bag. He is a good unit, but he suffers from abysmal jewel issues. I mean, we're talking he just does not have the jewels he needs to function as a unit. His jewel gain is relatively poor. He's not like he's super fast, and he's melee, so he has to run down his opponents. So getting that insane jewel gain, if you have his VCR sword, I think it has jewel gain on it, but I don't think there are any really good jewel gain swords per se. Not jewel gain on the level that he needs it anyways. I mean, we get 10 jewel gain on Sharon's sword, 6 on the Gurren. Do we have any other? So the Radiant Historia collab blade has 15 jewel gain, but you give up other stats to get it. There just really isn't an ideal jewel gain sword for him. So if you put this pouch on him with, you're going to want speed on him. So maybe put on a mix of speed and physical attack on his sword. Then you can run an HP armor or his own personal armor, depending on the situation. Technically speaking, his own personal armor you want to run for the extra AoE. But in this particular setup, I probably wouldn't run it because I need the HP. And then I would run that pouch on the end, and that would basically solve his jewel issues forever. Obviously, having his Nenso would be ideal, but his Nenso is... there are issues surrounding his Nenso I'm not going to get into right now. But so these are just a couple of ideas that I had. The other thing that it can do is it can just give other units that already have really good jewel gain an insane amount of jewel gain. And we're just talking like nutty levels, because think about this, right? So if you already had like 30 or 40 jewel gain, and you add an additional 40 on top of that, that's like somewhere between 70 to 80 jewel gain. That means pretty much for every single time you attack, you get somewhere between like 3 to like at least 1 skill, if not up to 3 or 4, depending on your unit. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a good idea for someone like Bashini, because his kit's already kind of maxed out. But you could probably, I could probably swap out the snow globe here and sack a little bit of extra evade and a little bit of attack, and in exchange get additional 25 jewel gain, and that would let Bashini function a little bit better as a unit because he wouldn't have so many jewel issues. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea for Bashini. I kind of like him the way he is, but it is an idea. Putting it on charge up units is another good idea. In this particular case, it might not be a good idea for Gorm because he obviously has to sack a speed item for this. But the point being is that if you have a charge up, being able to get all the jewels you need in a single attack for the entire charge up combo is very valuable. Because not all units are capable of getting that full combo off with a single attack to get their jewels back. It's definitely an interesting item. The problem with it is it's really hard to fit it on a lot of units. The stats that it gives are extremely weird, not giving any kind of like defensive or offensive stats. kind of gives like luxury stats. These are like stats that are like kind of thought of as secondary. The one stat we haven't looked at much yet though is the jump stat, and this is another thing that's really interesting. So let's take a look at Chloe here real quick, right? Chloe has 4 move, and that's good, but 1 jump, it's just not that great. There are maps that are somewhat steep that Chloe cannot scale as well because of that 1 jump, and a piece of gear like this might help her get there. So a very situational piece of gear for sure. The other end of the spectrum here is, let's pull up Moa here for a second. So Moa already has 4 jumps, so if you put that on, then she goes up to 6. Let's go over to Ramses. Ramses has 6 jump. If you put that piece of gear on, now Ramses is up to 8 jump. And you gotta ask yourself, is there some kind of map where if you could scale 8 spaces up vertically, can you skip some kind of mechanic? It can just like function almost like a TP up a cliff, allowing units that shouldn't be able to jump that high the ability to jump that high. I definitely think that if you are raiding in Japan right now, you definitely want to get your hands on this piece of gear. It is a very, very interesting piece of gear, and honestly, I haven't been this excited for a niche piece of gear like this for quite a while. It's really hard to put my finger on exactly what I find so fascinating about this piece of gear. It definitely opens up some new possibilities for units to behave in ways that they weren't really designed to. Sort of like the Wanderer's hat in Global. But there is obviously the downside of the all status resist minus 100, which basically means if you can be hit by a status, you're gonna get hit by the status. It's that simple. And also you have to sack that gear slot to make this work. Normally your jewel gain gear slot is shared with speed, because the 2 major jewel gain items that you would think to use, which are the I believe this is the Belva Pendant, which is 15 jewel gain and 10 speed, as well as the Meteor, the Saint Meteor, which is 10 speed and 10 jewel gain. These are your major jewel gain items that you run. I generally will only run Teddy if I'm getting speed from somewhere else. And Teddy is more of a defensive option to begin with. I sometimes use Teddy to replace an armor for the HP value and the jewel gain. So I kind of treat Teddy as a HP jewel gain HP armor than an actual accessory, and I will sub out an armor then to use it. Not to say that this is how you have to play. Once again, we're just theory crafting here, and I'm kind of just rambling, but it's definitely interesting for sure. So I really don't have much else to say about this right now. Once again, I'll know more about this piece of gear when I do finally get it. And I should have it tomorrow or the day after. Really, I want to have this by tomorrow because I want to get along with my raid. Because I want to get at least 2 of these, to be honest. I'd like to get at least 2 of these. If I can get 3, that would be excellent. All I really need is to get 2 max, and then I need to get well, actually, since it's a 5-star piece of gear, I'm going to have to proc the 3rd one, aren't I? But that's a problem for me to solve later. I need to see how good the gear is first. For all I know, I might just be overthinking this, and it might not really hold that much value. But we haven't really seen a piece of gear like this where it just over-indexes on 2 stats that are just not super common to run alone. Like, the jewels obtained or jewel gain is always run with another stat. It's never run alone because there's almost no way to fit it on a build alone, so you basically have to sacrifice something, which is part of the downside. And this is a common theme with a lot of the raid gears. Most of the past raid gears have had some kind of major or minor downside to using them, and generally speaking, the more major the downside is, the more specialized and powerful the upside is. But I feel like this one has tipped the balance a little bit, where the downside isn't necessarily as bad as the... Well, not necessarily that it's not as bad, but it's not as in comparison, I feel like the ups are more powerful compared to the downsides on this one, as opposed to another piece of raid gear, such as this piece of gear right here. And I am actually going to make a separate video on this, because this is also a very interesting piece of gear. This is a piece of support gear, and it is only for supports. There is pretty much no way to make it work for anything but supports. It's a very simple piece of gear and what it does, but I'm going to actually probably go over this with you in a separate video, and I think what I might do is I might make a video on all of these weird raid gears, because it's a very interesting series of gears that they have made, where basically it's free gear, it's relatively easy to get, and they both have upsides and they have downsides, and sometimes you will actually get a downside that can be turned into an upside, like the Christmas scarf, which the downside is obviously the -10 speed on it, but it has some other things on it that make it a really nice item to have, and I have actually used this to clear competitive content, as well as I have used this to beat Rakina EX in, what was it, 5 turns, I believe? Or was it 4? I think I couldn't pull off the 4. I think it was 5 turns that I had to beat it in. But yeah, so that's all I have for this video. Expect more of these to come. I don't know when I'm going to get them out or when I'm going to get around to it, but I'd like to kind of go over some more niche pieces of gear and the ways that they can be used, and just specialized things that aren't necessarily common, but if you pull them out at the right time, they can be make or break whether you clear a map or not. So thanks for listening to me ramble, guys. Obviously not all of my videos are going to be quite like this one. This one was very different from what I normally did. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you next time.